recently because I felt like it was no longer working
Mm,
um, the way it was supposed to work in the day, but I thought it was kind of interfering with my sleep.
mhm.
So I quit. I had one day of really crummy withdrawal, and then I didn't drink any coffee for about a week or week and a half or something like that. And
Mhm.
now I have a little occasionally when I really need it, and it's amazing how well it works, but it had lost its effect on me for a while, so
Mhm. I am a barista, actually, so I can totally relate to it losing its effect, hence why I could drink coffee at 7:30 in the evening.
yeah.
But if you're ready, I think, we're good to get started, if you would like
Yeah.
to.
Yeah, I think I'm
Okay.
ready. Yeah.
So, I am a very proud alumni of Suffolk County Community College, and I currently attend Stony Brook University. And I absolutely love it there. But a lot of the experience I had, particularly at Suffolk County Community College when I was attending there, really shaped who I am today and the paths that I've gone on. So, my first question is, how did your time at SUNY Purchase contribute to your success today? Some of the lessons that you've learned.
Well,
Yeah.
I might say that I also went to Nassau Community College for a year, and
Really?
then I went to SUNY Purchase. Purchase was fantastic for me. I think it's important to try to find a place where you feel like it's a good fit, and that was an incredible fit. It was kind of an experimental school at that time. We didn't have we didn't just have classes like you have in most places where you just sign up for this class or that class. They had these things that were sort of like the classes were kind of bundled together toward a major. There were these short semesters. It wasn't just 2 semesters for the year. It was three.
Mhm.
The middle one was shorter, and usually you would do that away someplace and take only one very intensive course. And then as a senior, you had to do a senior thesis. So I learned how to do research on birds, and I after that I did a lot of research on birds. But I learned how to do research on birds while I was there. I got along really well with my advisor, and I loved living in the dorms. It was really a great experience for me there.
Mhm. That's fantastic. So getting into your career, and you just kind of touched on it a little bit. So I'll share about myself because I was so excited to interview, and I told my grandfather about you, and he is very excited to watch this back later.
Oh, good.
Um, but I grew up with my grandfather, and we always had a huge garden, and we still to this day have a huge garden every year. And he's very passionate about maintaining that ecosystem. And that's really where I was taught that lesson about the environment. And it was through food because I knew, in order to have these beautiful tomatoes that we had every year or have the string beans and have that luxury really for a lot of people being able to pick them from your backyard, it all depended on the environment that sustained it. And he taught me, we put worms in the soil because the worms contribute to this, and we don't kill spiders because the spiders help with these things. So I'm really wondering what sparked that interest for you in the environment. What was kind of that moment that led you to, this career that you've gone on to lead?
Well, I've always really loved animals, and I'm not exactly sure why, but my father's hobby was breeding canaries. We lived in Brooklyn until I was 10 years old. So we lived in a very small apartment, but there were always birds singing. And I could see from, 2 inches away, I could see birds getting on and off their eggs or feeding these little tiny little chicks. And then when I was 7 years old, from the time I was 7 till the time I was 10, I had my own flock of homing pigeons in Brooklyn. So it always seemed to me like um, these animals, that in broad strokes, their lives were very much like ours. They were just trying to keep alive, find food, and raise their babies. My pigeons had nest boxes that were stacked up in boxes of fruit crates. We'd put a bowl in there. They would figure out who they wanted to marry, and they would build their own nest, and they would be gone a lot of the day, and then they would come back and have supper and feed their babies and go to bed. And across the yard, we lived in our own stack of boxes. That was our apartment building where people had decided who they were going to marry, and they made their own nest, and they were gone for a lot of the day. They came back, had supper, fed their babies, and went to bed. So it always seemed like we were basically all the same, except the same in a different way. And then I learned that there were some things that were endangered. I learned that when I was a small kid, and that didn't seem good. So I wondered if maybe someday I could help that problem. And then we moved to Nassau County, and we moved not far away, maybe 1 mile away from a pretty big patch of woods. And I loved going into the woods. I used to collect plants and make terrariums and look for salamanders and other, small things to put in the terrariums, and look for birds. I just fool around in there, with trying to learn about the plants and the animals that lived there. And one day I got on my bike and I went to go to the woods, and there were bulldozers there knocking all the trees down. That was very, very shocking. And I think in that moment it made me want to protect nature, I guess, to put it that way. Protect wild things in wild places and natural places. Now it's all office buildings. My woods are office buildings now.
Yeah. And, unfortunately, that is something that we're continuing to see. I'm very fortunate to have been raised on the East End, so we haven't quite gotten to that point yet.
Mhm. What town on the East End?
Manorville. So I live in the Pine Barrens.
That's very
So
nice.
yeah. So I'm very fortunate to still have those experiences and live in a place that's protected. Um, but for other places that again don't have that luxury, we owe it to raise our voices and to say this is something that's sacred, this is something that's beautiful. And I really love the comparison that you drew, to the birds living in their boxes and people living in their boxes.
Mhm.
Because in a lot of ways we are so similar. We have a very
Right.
similar goal, which is to live our lives. Um, and if we could find joy within all of that, that's a profoundly beautiful thing. So thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Um, so into our next question, what are some of the challenges that you've faced pursuing your career? And relating to any of those, what are some of the ways that you were able to kind of conceptualize them and combat them and overcome them in any way?
I think the biggest couple of challenges are, and they're sort of interrelated. I just didn't understand how because I felt like I was nobody. How could a nobody like myself ever be involved in any interesting things? Where do you meet people? How do you make any kind of connection to anything like that? I used to watch a show on television called Wild Kingdom when I was a little kid, and these guys, basically they caught wild animals and they tagged them so that they could learn how they live, so that they could help protect them. This was the kind of thing that was, when I saw that, I thought, that's exactly what I want to do. But the idea of me being able to do that seemed impossible. It didn't seem like somebody like me could do that, because I knew no one who was really involved in anything interesting in the world. That's my parents and relatives just were not out in the world like that, and they couldn't help me. Nobody could tell me anything. I didn't, even when I was in college, I didn't know what graduate school was. It was, I was blundering around with a real tremendous lack of information. And partly because I felt like I don't know what's going on, and I don't know how you could ever be um, involved in anything. How could I get involved in anything? That made me feel sort of, low self-esteem, you would call it nowadays, not about me, but about my ability to ever have a career or connect with people, or that people who were doing things that I might have read about or seen on television could ever possibly get interested in me. You know, I thought I was an okay person, and I was doing some things that were fun and really interesting. I was a musician. I paid all my tuition playing the drums in bands. I used to go camping in the woods. I used to go fishing a lot, and I had a lot of fun, and I had a good life. But I didn't feel like I could ever connect uh, to a career, and because I didn't understand the path or what the paths could be, I didn't even know how to talk to teachers or professors about it. So that, unfortunately, I wasted a lot of energy worrying about all of that stuff, and I really, I didn't need to. But when I see young people who don't know how they can do things, or what they will do, or any of that, I was very much like that, more than most people, I think.
Mhm. Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to do this interview because I think putting a face to a career um, is such a pivotal moment in so many people's lives. I think many people can relate to that feeling of, I know I like this and this seems very interesting, but I don't have the tools. How do I do it? And again, like you were
Right.
saying, that this
Mhm.
feeling of, well, who am I, to go out and to go and do that? Especially if I don't have any direction to go to. Um, so I think what you're doing today is amazing because you're giving some people those tools, just saying this is what I do, and this is how I did it, um, is so important. I want to thank you for that, and I think that was very good advice.
Well, thank you for having me with you tonight.
I very much appreciate it. Um, so this is a very kind of similar question in that vein. What advice would you give to SUNY students today, knowing what you know now, in terms of pursuing career fields and finding their own path?
Yeah, well, I think the biggest advice along these lines is sort of like, it's sort of a metaphor. It's that life and the career part of life is like walking at night with a flashlight. You can't see your destination. You might not even know exactly where you're going to end up, but every step you take will light the next few steps, and you can make the whole trip that way. Even after I got my PhD, once I figured out some things and I had a PhD and I had a job with an environmental group, I had no idea that I would be spending most of my time, and in fact, most of my career, as a writer, and that I would be writing a series of books and articles. I was I was trained as an ecologist. I wanted to work outside with animals, have done a lot of that. But then because of my concern about conservation, I got I pursued and I got involved in and sort of pulled into some big conservation battles. And I worked on those for quite a few years, close to 10 years. In the middle of that, I started doing more writing, and I published my first book, and that was a totally pivotal thing that changed the trajectory of my career. But I didn't see that coming. When I finished my PhD as an ecologist, I didn't see that I would spend close to 10 years working on policy aspects of conservation fights. I wanted to work outdoors with animals, but after I did that a lot, I thought, I could do a lot more for them by getting deeply involved in the laws and the policies that were affecting them, and dictate what people can and cannot legally do. So, um, my advice is just keep trying to get closer to what you're interested in. Just ask people around you. Try to, it's different stages, right? If you're in high school, it's different than if you've just gotten a PhD. But um, ask people around you, write to people. I did start to get involved with professional research in two ways. I wrote a letter to somebody that whose work I had read about that seemed fantastic to me. He was breeding falcons to try to reintroduce them after most of the falcons, peregrine falcons, had gotten wiped out by DDT and other hard pesticides. After the DDT was banned, they thought that the environment had been cleaning itself up enough to maybe allow these birds to survive, but they wouldn't breed in captivity. And this guy had figured out a way to get them to breed. So I wrote to him. He responded, incredibly enough. I went to visit him, and that led to a job introducing some of these birds, not with him, but with people that were affiliated with him that he told me about. Same thing when I was in college. I had a professor the last semester I was there. He was a great guy. He was doing research on birds. I simply volunteered. I'll help you do that. And I did. And I didn't really understand anything about graduate school. So one day I asked him, "Can you explain to me what is graduate school and what is a master's degree?" And he introduced me to a woman who became my master's advisor and my PhD advisor at Rutgers University. So before all of that, I was sitting there thinking, I don't know how to do anything. But uh, one step does lead to another step, and persistence and perseverance is what all successful people have in common. What they don't have in common is succeeding all the time and not being rejected and not being turned down. They all have been rejected. They all have been turned down. They all have failed to do things, but they have kept at it until they had a little breakthrough or a few little breakthroughs or a big breakthrough. That's what makes them successful, is the ability to persist and not just give up, because often you feel like giving up, especially early. The worst year of my life was the year right after I got my bachelor's degree. I was just flailing. And luckily, I kept at it.
Mhm. And I think you made a really good point there about asking questions. I think so many people are afraid to ask questions because they're afraid of looking foolish. And I myself am guilty of that. It's like I can't let anybody know that I don't know something. But then it just perpetuates, the issue.
It perpetuates your ignorance. So that,
Yeah.
there's no such thing as a bad question.
No.
Right? And you should always, I've often said, let me just ask you because I don't know this. And
Hmm.
boy, what a relief to get that out, because then you know what it is that you're trying to figure out.
Hmm.
Saves a lot of time.
It does. It certainly does. So thank you. Because we have a little bit more time, and if you don't mind, I would like to ask one more question, if
Yes,
that
of
is
course.
okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, and this is a tricky question, but I'm just curious because I really admire the work that you've done.
Thank you.
But reflecting on your career up until this point, um, is there a moment that stands out? Is there, something that was exceedingly rewarding? Something that you can pinpoint during that time that you look back on and say, those years of flailing a little bit, it's worth it now.
Well, there are so many things. Let me just say that I've done many of the things that I dreamt of doing and was sure were impossible. So, was there a thing that made the flailing seem worthwhile? No, there's been about 40 years worth of great things that have made that flailing worthwhile. And I have found myself in places seeing things that I just couldn't believe I was ever actually really there. I think maybe the first time that I just thought, wow, I can't believe this, is, as I told you, I had a great interest in peregrine falcons, and I worked on that project to reintroduce some captive bred peregrines to the wild. Well, basically, we had to care for these little chicks while they got big, and then after they started flying, while they were learning to hunt. So that took about maybe that was about a month-long project. But 11 years, 10 years after that, 10 years after that, after writing to a guy who was running a project with peregrine falcons in natural nests in Greenland, I wrote to him every year for 6 years. Can I please come and work on your project? I got 5 no's, and then I got a letter saying, God, if you really want to come this bad, I might as well say okay. So I got flown in a military plane to Arctic Greenland. We were dropped by a helicopter in total wilderness. The helicopter left and everything went completely silent around us. And the next day, I was rappelling on a rope on a huge cliff, hundreds of feet above a valley floor, with a wild peregrine falcon screaming as she was streaking past me. And I went to the nest on the rock ledge where she had a couple of chicks, and we put bands on their legs, and we took some blood samples to measure their DDT levels. They were doing much better in the Arctic because there was no farming up there. And I just looked around, and I felt like somebody had just dropped me in my fantasy movie. But I've had many experiences like that since then.
Of course. And that's amazing. That's absolutely incredible. So I want to thank you again for taking the time to talk to me today and really share your story with all of the students that are watching. And I'm trying to think of something a little bit more profound to say other than just thank you and that this is an amazing conversation. And I am really, really fortunate that you were able to share this time with me. So thank you so much.
Well, you know what? I think thank you is about the most profound thing that we can say, because first of all, gratitude is an unbelievably important thing. And you tend to get more and more of it as you get older and you realize how lucky we are simply to be alive. But the other thing is that when I write, most of my work now is writing books. And when I write books in a room by myself, where I am right now at this desk. I don't have contact with other people when I'm writing, and I don't know if my writing is going to make any difference. So if I've come to your attention and you value what I do enough to say thank you, that makes everything very worthwhile for me. So I really thank you for saying so.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So, okay. I don't really know exactly how we're going to wrap this up. Taryn, do you have anything to add?
No, absolutely. I just also want to say, thank you so much for joining us. This has been such an incredible interview to watch, and I really appreciate everything that you've done.
Thank you so much. It's very kind.
Have a good night, everybody.
Have a good night.
Okay.
Thank you again. Bye.
Bye-bye. Anytime.